button, you probably will get a notification that you are being recorded. Feel free to show your face if you feel comfortable doing so. If not, that's okay too. My name is Rachel Williams. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the director of the Phoenix Center at CU Anschutz. We offer services to folks who've experienced interpersonal violence and are located on our Anschutz campus. So that's student, staff, or faculty here. If anyone is feeling triggered or upset by anything in this presentation, which can come up, we know, when we're talking about such a sensitive topic, just know that we are available to talk to during and after the presentation. Feel free to message me directly. Also, if you have questions, Abby has said that you can put them in the chat or ask them throughout, but we will also have a Q&A portion afterwards, after the presentation. So just know that that will also be offered. So without further ado, I will introduce Abby. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation to be here. Really excited to be able to share a little bit with you all, and thank you, Rachel, for that trigger warning. I definitely echo that, that this is important work. It's also challenging work, and self-care and really recognizing our own needs remains a priority. So I appreciate that. My name is Abby. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I am coming to you from Safehouse Denver. I'm the Chief Program Officer. Safehouse Denver is a community-based domestic violence program in the city of Denver that provides a full continuum of supportive services for survivors of domestic violence. Wanted to come and talk with you today specifically about our approach to domestic violence advocacy. And hopefully with some of those nuggets, there might be some pieces that resonate with your work or sort of new ways of looking at this work. So this presentation is really focused on empowerment-based, trauma-informed, and survivor-centered services. So wanted to start the conversation with really comparing the role of a domestic violence advocate with traditional mental health counseling, therapy. We know that there are many folks that come to this work that come from that more traditional mental health background. I myself am one of those people. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. It's definitely my experience, but a lot of people that get involved as a volunteer, interns, people that do this work have some of that mental health background. And so it's really important to understand the places that advocacy and therapy overlap and the places that they are critically different. So the first is in our approach and our practice. So traditional mental health therapy, although I will add the disclaimer that I do think that we in the mental health field have been pretty progressive in the last decade or so, but traditional mental health is really built off of a Western medical model. It's really about treating an illness. Whereas in the advocacy world, we see trauma responses as normal expressions of people that have faced abnormal situations. So it's just a sort of a slightly different way of kind of understanding our role in supporting a survivor. Also, for the domestic violence advocacy field, I think it's really important that we honor the lay leaders of the movement. So if we think about, back decades ago, 1970s, when we used to call this the battered women's movement, the way that we have talked about it has shifted for good reasons over the few decades. But it started out as a group of people, survivors, getting together in each other's living rooms and talking about their shared experiences. And those survivors used their voice to advocate for policy changes and cultural shifts, and did not have necessarily have any sort of background in mental health or law. Their voice was their position of expertise. And so I think it's really important nowadays, as we continue to professionalize this work, to really honor those leaders. We also have some basic philosophical differences. So like I said, we see this as a social justice issue, really rooted in issues of power, privilege, and oppression. Again, mental health counseling has shifted over the years, and I think that we've done a really great job of including that voice of marginalized communities. But knowing that that stemmed from these places, especially the early domestic violence movement. And then finally, there are important legal differences that are critical to understanding our role. So as community-based domestic violence advocates, clients have privilege with us, which is different from folks in that mental health arena, where there is a mental health professional has an ethical obligation to confidentiality. They could potentially, there might be some civil implications if they did not hold confidentiality. But for a community-based domestic violence advocate, there's actually federal and state law that requires that we hold confidentiality, and the privilege is owned by survivors. So survivors have privilege with us. It also means that there are differences with our mandatory reporting requirement. So many folks in the mental health world will know that they are required to report if there is known or suspected child abuse or neglect. In the state of Colorado, also duty to warn, right? If you have a survivor who is an immediate threat to themselves or others, and elder abuse. In the Colorado statute, the only place legally that community-based victim advocates or domestic violence advocates are able to compromise privilege is for the child abuse or neglect piece. So we are mandatory reporters of child abuse and neglect. Something that I say to my staff all the time is, it doesn't mean that we won't do anything. If we see that one of our clients or survivors is struggling with suicidal escalation or potentially a harm to others, it doesn't mean we won't intervene, but it means that we have a legal obligation to do so in a way that protects confidentiality. So this is a quote that I'll be very transparent. I stole this from a webinar that I went to probably a while ago, and such a wonderful sort of way of understanding our role. And I never wrote down the citation, so to this day, I don't know who to give credit to, but somewhere out there, there is somebody who came up with a really wonderful way of expressing what we do. So it says, if the fundamental harm of abuse is that someone doesn't get to live their own life, then the repair of that harm must be liberation, autonomy, and self-determination. So this is, for me, really the heart of why we approach the work the way that we do. And there are three main tenets of the work. We use a trauma-informed care model, we use an empowerment-based model, and we use client-centered or survivor-centered services. We're going to kind of break that down a little bit. So trauma-informed care, the 6 guiding principles of the trauma-informed care model, this comes from the CDC. This is something that you will see transcend DV work, right? Like this is something that is nowadays used in the medical model, and certainly in mental health work, and in lots of different arenas. And the 6 guiding principles start with safety. And then we have trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. So the way in which we implement these 6 guiding principles might look a little bit different in our DV-related work, and they are rooted back in the same basic tenets. So taking a look at how we use this trauma-informed care model, specifically in the DV arena. So first, we ensure that survivors have access to advocacy services in an environment that is inclusive, welcoming, and destigmatizing. We attend to physical and emotional safety needs and health of the survivors. We help survivors to increase their emotional capacity to work through various and complex issues they will inevitably face in their journey. We provide information about the effects of trauma and create opportunities for survivors to discuss their unique responses. We offer thoughtful and specifically tailored resources and referrals when wanted and appropriate. And finally, we self-reflect. So going back to this first one, so we do everything that is within our power to create the most welcoming and destigmatizing environment. It does not mean that we are ever in a position to remove all triggers. Survivors experience triggers in a variety of different ways. Some of them are common and more predictable, and some are not. And so I think it's really important for us to sort of have a baseline understanding of we recognize themes and trends in survivor needs, and there will always be one-off things that come up that are potentially triggering for survivors. So it's not in the fact that we did or did not remove a potential trigger in an environment. It's what we do when someone is triggered by something in their environment. And then going back to that last one, the self-reflection piece is so critical in our work. This work is challenging. This work changes us. This work brings out our own human reactions. Whether or not an advocate brings any sort of personal experience with domestic violence or trauma, we bring our humanness to the table. And every one of us have places and spaces that might be potentially triggering for us. So the burden is really on us to have a space that we utilize regularly to separate our own human reactions from the reactions of our clients. And that is only done through self-reflection. Self-reflection can be something that we do sort of in private as we're kind of doing our own debrief and processing a situation, an encounter with a survivor, or it might be something that you do with a supervisor or a peer group. And then moving on to empowerment-based model or empowerment-based services. So it's important that we acknowledge the injustice of the world and offer a space to discuss solutions or next steps. But it's really important to start with the acknowledgement piece and not jump to solutions. There are many people who, being very task-oriented and solutions-oriented, may have a tendency to jump to the next steps. Totally understandable. And I encourage folks to resist that temptation, to sit with that acknowledgement of the injustice, sit with that discomfort for a moment until survivor makes the choice whether or not they are in a space where they want to start discussing solutions. It could absolutely be an encounter where a survivor just wants to sit in the heaviness of the injustice and is not open to hearing next steps right now. The more that we lean in and support them where they're at, the more likely that once they work through that feeling and become at a place where they're able to talk about solutions, the more likely they're going to reach out to us for support in that process. So we're going to acknowledge that the survivor is the expert of their own lived experience. We support survivors in their own decision-making process. And then we don't give clients power back because it's not ours to give. So this one is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine in the way that just sort of limitations of the English language, right? But we often say that, we want to be able to give clients the power back. And if you just sort of stop and think about the way that we phrase that, it's inherently problematic, right? Because if we are in a position to give clients power, then we are using that power. Our intention for using that power may be to be helpful and supportive. But if we still are positioning ourselves as in that position of power and privilege, that's a misuse of our own authority and position. So instead, we're going to create opportunities, create spaces where survivors might acknowledge the power that they already inherently do have, and make decisions about how they want to move forward using that power. And then finally here, empowerment-based advocacy is much more challenging when survivors are not wanting to engage in their own decision-making processes, or they're engaging in a way that's different from our own values and desires. So I would be curious to hear from you all. My guess is that many of you have found yourself in a position where you're working with somebody who is experiencing that place of stuck, or making decisions and working through their journey in a way that really rubs up against your own set of personal values. We hear this a lot when survivors are needing and choosing to stay or go back to an abusive relationship. It's definitely a human instinct to say, "Ugh, that's not what I want for you. Let me tell you what I think is right for you." And really the challenge is to resist that instinct and recognize that the survivor is the expert of their own experience. And then moving to survivor-centered services. So we're really going to join with the survivor here to address their needs through this dance of guiding, right? So it's a collaborative process. So the work of guiding a survivor in their journey towards healing includes a mix of lots of different tools. So we're going to use that active listening. We're going to draw from our own training and resources that we might have available. We're going to bring understanding and awareness, and we're going to be walking alongside the survivor in their self-identified goals. So we might use the term "I'm curious" a lot in our work with the survivor. I'm curious what this choice might look like for you. I'm curious how this resource might help for you. I'm curious what you think your next steps might be. I'm curious how you think that next step would help you in your journey. So as advocates, we focus on survivors' strengths while understanding and recognizing how abuse and trauma may impact their everyday lives. And we sort of bridge resources and help them engage in those resources. So through this collaborative process, survivors maintain control in rebuilding their lives by defining their own journey. So that's really sort of the heart of survivor-centered services, is recognizing that this is their journey. And our job is to be a collaborator and to use skills, a lot of that sort of motivational interviewing skills for those that have more of a mental health background, to help the survivor themselves identify where their journey is going.
I want to pose a question. That's a big one. But I get this a lot working with medical professionals and future medical professionals who are working in like clinical settings and hospitals where they may be spending, only 5 to 10 minutes with someone. And if they are having these feelings that someone might be in an abusive situation, I think there's this hesitation of like, do I bring it up, or do I just let these patients bring it up on their own? But, again, with the time restraints, it's really difficult for them to gauge, like, when is it appropriate and in what way can they bring up these concerns? And so I don't know if you have any recommendations for that sort of support.
Yeah, it's tricky. I get that question often for people that their interventions are short in duration and short term, in terms of they may not have this person, in their clinic or office again. So, how do I prioritize? I feel that given that we have basic training on red flags for abuse, we have enough of a skill set to trust our gut, that if somebody is presenting in a way where we're wondering about that and we're worried about that, then that is a moment to ask. That's a moment to use our position to open up that conversation. I think with empowerment-based work, it's recognizing that we really have sort of a resource to give. Like, I'm recognizing some signs here, and I might be somebody that can guide you in a direction that would be helpful and safe for you. And it is the survivor's choice whether to engage and lean in that conversation. And that's where it can be really tricky, because it very well could be that the survivor, for a variety of reasons, is not going to lean into that conversation and is not ready to share. And so then the burden becomes on us as advocates to honor where they are in their journey. And if the only takeaway from that very brief intervention is we're planting a seed, that there is somebody that noticed and somebody who cared enough to ask, that seed will grow, because I see it over the years and years and years that survivors do remember those moments, and remember that there was a helping professional who didn't push, that didn't misuse their power, and allowed the survivor, when they're ready, to loop back around and reach out for support. So yeah, it really rubs up against our own values when we're worried about client safety. I don't think there's anything wrong with reflecting, I'm worried for you. It's about how you handle the response from the survivor. So I was like, I'm not worried for myself, not ready to talk about it. Okay, so when you are, know that I'm here, kind of thing. So you're right, that's a really big question. And it's much easier said than done, I get, in those moments. And you might not be expecting it, right? It comes up so quickly. And this is where, I always encourage folks to reach out, to us or to supervisors or to peers to get that support after those moments, so that we can sort of check our own instincts, I guess, with that. Yeah, thanks for that question, though. All right, so I was going to move into some of the common pitfalls in advocacy. So the four sort of main buckets I think that these fit into for me are this trauma triangle, or sort of a rescuer mentality, a tendency to give advice, a dislike of discomfort and wanting to avoid discomfort, and being more outcome focused than process focused. So we'll kind of dig through these a little bit. So if we look at our trauma triangle, I'm not sure how many of you have seen this particular model before. This can be thought of as triangulation or a trauma triangle. It's also sort of the underlying tenet of rescuing. So if you think about it, when an advocate is engaging with a victim or survivor or client who's at the bottom of this triangle here, from the position of rescuer, they're tapping into their own position of power and privilege. Even though their intention might be to support, it keeps the survivor in that position of victim. Because what we're doing is simply switching the power from persecutor or abuser or perpetrator. We're switching that power to us as rescuer. The intention, again, want to recognize that the intentions are to support, but it's actually not supportive. It's actually not in the long term recognizing that survivor already owns their own power to make choices for themselves. So we really need to ask ourselves in those moments, are we operating from a place of what is in the best interest of the survivor, or are we attending to our own needs here? And those needs could come from our own system of values and our own desires for wanting a survivor to be safe. It's uncomfortable for me to see a survivor walk out the door because I'm worried about their safety, right? But that's still about me. If a survivor has made the decision that it is best and safest for them to walk out the door and go back to their abuser, we need to trust and recognize the power that the survivor has to recognize that they're the expert of their own experience and know that and are able to navigate that situation in a way that is best for them. Also remembering that we are role modeling conflict resolution skills in every interaction with survivors. So really pushing survivors to, instead of running, excuse me, instead of running away from that discomfort, to lean into that discomfort. So, an example that I often use, sort of an overly simplistic example from a traditional shelter environment. So we often get, folks in residential services that will come to staff, with sort of, with conflicts with their roommates or housemates, and they might come to staff and say, Sally Sue stole my shampoo, and so I need you to go and kick out Sally Sue. And for many folks, the sort of gut instinct and inclination might be to run to the roommate and sort of take on that communication role for survivor. But instead, really what we need to do is support and walk alongside the survivor and that person communicating directly back to the person that caused harm in a safe environment. So another one is advice giving. So telling clients what they should do, what is the better or best choice based off their own thoughts, feelings, and assessments. So when does this typically come up for advocates? When a client asks us directly, and that happens a lot. A client will say, I don't know what to do. I need you to tell me what to do. I need advice. It could happen when we disagree with a client's choice or foresee more barriers in a client's life. And it can also be a shortcut when we're super busy, we don't have enough time, and we just want to skip to solutions. And it's really critical that we resist that temptation, right? So why is this an issue? First and foremost, it can lead to vicarious trauma because it puts the responsibility on us as advocates to be responsible for an outcome that we don't have any power to control. If it discounts the survivor's voice as the expert of their own lives and their own desires for themselves, it reinforces for the survivor that others know better. It reinforces for the survivor that they are dependent on others. So how to avoid advice giving? And it can creep up that inclination to offer advice. And even if you don't use the word advice, or your brain is telling you, I'm not giving advice because I'm not using that word. It creeps in there. So really sort of the antidote to advice giving is staying curious. So acknowledging why someone would want advice and communicate our limitations as advocates. So even just pausing the conversation there, I hear that I hear you that you feel like you don't have the answers right now. And, it sounds like you're wanting somebody with answers. So again, avoiding jumping to that step of providing solutions. So explore with survivor what they think and what they might want to do. Explore what they might need to make a decision. Explore what is causing them to doubt their own ability to make that decision for themselves. And oftentimes when you lean into that one in particular, you really dig up domestic violence specific trauma. We know the nature of abusive relationships is such that perpetrators often use mental manipulation and gaslighting, such that survivors doubt that they even know their own reality. But in a safe environment, such as, any sort of clinic, domestic violence program, services, it is a safe space for them to lean into their own natural ability to make decisions that are right for them. And then finally, being comfortable with silence. We don't do this so well in our culture. Some folks struggle with this more than others, but silence is an important part of our work, and being willing to sit in that instead of rushing to fill that space. So talking a little bit more about avoiding discomfort. So I will hear a lot from advocates who will jump to, well, that's not trauma informed, because they hear a story that a survivor was uncomfortable. But I will push back and say, just because somebody is uncomfortable doesn't mean that we exposed them or put them through a process that was causing harm. because we can't control broken systems, right? We can't control limitations due to our own legal obligations or our organizational policies. So it doesn't mean that our services are not trauma informed because we're living within those systems. It's in how we do it, right? We can control our approach and our own process. So it could even be a simple acknowledgement of, I know that the way that we need to talk today and the paperwork that we need to fill out today and the things that we need to accomplish today are not something that you want to do, are causing some triggers right now. I acknowledge that. And given that this is a limitation that we are working with, what can we do together as a collaborative team to minimize those triggers and support you in this uncomfortable process? So also recognizing that rescuing survivors from uncomfortable things is not realistic, it's not kind, and it's not empowering. So instead, we need to be role modeling to guide clients in discerning between what is uncomfortable and unsafe. So many times we will have survivors say, let's go back to the example of the roommate that stole the shampoo. And if we do our jobs and resist that urge to run to the roommate and resolve conflict for survivor, we might have that survivor come back and say, this place is unsafe. You all aren't helping me. And really helping to pause in that moment, recognize that a client is feeling unsafe, and helping them to discern, is what you're experiencing right now truly a danger? And it maybe there is information that we don't know, about roommate being a physical threat to that person. But 99% of the time, it's a perceived danger based on, the fight, flight, or freeze, the neurobiology of trauma that we're hardwired when things are on face value, not actually dangerous, but our brain is reacting to it as such. So when things actually in reality are safe, but we don't like the feelings that are coming up, that's uncomfortable. And that is something as advocates we can work with. And then we really need to understand that our goal is process, not outcome, because we have to focus on what is within our control. So if we focus on the what, we're looking at results, we're looking at accomplishments, we're looking at the resources that a survivor has accessed, how things end up. We want to know the end of the story, where people go. We are not actually in control of any of those. But if we focus on the process, the how we use our voice, how we use our body language, what language we use, the intentions behind our behavior, those are things that are within our control. And then a note here on compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and burnout. Because when we are doing our job as advocates and we are working within these empowerment-based, trauma-informed, and survivor-centered methods of practice, these things are going to come up: compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and burnout, because it brings out our humanness. And again, we are self-reflecting on our humanness. So to kind of compare and contrast between these terms that are often used interchangeably, but actually mean different things. So compassion fatigue, it's really when we just don't have feelings or empathy or desire to help at all anymore, because we've become sort of tapped out, if you will. Vicarious trauma, or can be called secondary trauma, that's when the survivor's trauma becomes ours, and it impacts our own worldview or belief of our own safety. That's when we start having a hard time discerning between uncomfortable and unsafe. And then burnout. This is really when there's sort of that chronic workplace stress. If you're working in organizations and systems that mirror the crises of survivors, that can lead to burnout if it's not successfully managed. So feeling depleted of energy, wanting to take distance from your job, feeling negative and cynical, and it can lead to reduced professional efficacy. So I say this because I believe that in this field, in this work, we do a really wonderful job of talking about vicarious trauma prevention. We talk about self-care, we talk about bubble baths and journaling. That's wonderful and that's great. And let's talk about vicarious trauma intervention, because no matter how many bubble baths you take and how much journaling you do, when we're doing this work to our best, it does change us. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to change every aspect in a profound way, but we come out with a different worldview. And so it's really important to understand that we need to be always intervening in our own vicarious trauma. So I'm going to pause there. I see that there is a question in the chat, and I definitely want to, like I said, make room for your all questions, because I understand that you are coming from different roles and may engage with survivors in different ways. So please feel free to use the chat or shout out.
Abby, I just want to acknowledge we can hear you and see your PowerPoint fine, but I think a lot of folks aren't able to visually see you.
I wonder why that is.
I almost didn't want to say it to jinx the audio, but
did it stop or?
Oh, there you are.
Sorry about that. I didn't even notice. I saw myself at the beginning and then I sort of minimized my little screen there. So let me know if that happens again. So I see a question. I really appreciate that you mentioned the phrase, I'm curious. Are there other phrases similar to that you found yourself using often to avoid advice giving? So yeah, phrases like, help me understand that. Let's see, I'm curious, help me understand. I think just that active listening piece where we just sort of reflect back a little bit of what we hear. Like, this is what I'm hearing. Let me know if this matches what you were expressing. I don't know, I'd love to put that question back on you all, to kind of share a little bit. Are there other phrases that feel more comfortable for you, that other people have sort of come up with as their go-to?
I feel like in the past I've used, like, I hear that you're saying XYZ and then like repeat back what they're saying. But yeah, I just really like the, like, I'm curious about, and I was just wondering about other phrases. That was super helpful.
Yeah, this is something that I relate to parenting a lot. If you have a kid that's saying, I really want that candy, I really want you to buy that toy, I really want this, instead of jumping to, no, we can't have that, and here's why, staying with I hear that you really want that, and leaving it right there, avoiding that temptation to go to that next step, right? So just kind of rephrasing and reframing. So I'm looking at this next question here. Are there any ways you see the field of advocacy going in the future? Any hopes for new ideas or practices related to advocacy work? That's a big question. Yeah. Here's how I will answer that. I think that it is a double-edged sword, that this field is becoming more and more professionalized. Again, like I said, I come from I bring education and clinical experience to this work. So the burden becomes on me to acknowledge that I'm in a position of educational privilege, and I think that we need to do a better job of remembering that we bring those skills and experience to the work, but it is not the work, right? And honoring the people who actually did the work decades ago. I think this also really ties into DEI work that I know that we all have been talking about as a community, right? Simple things like Do we have educational expectations posted in our job descriptions? Why? If we do, why? There are lay leaders that did so much more than what I've ever done in this field that didn't have any sort of degrees or licensure or you know, mental health experience or whatnot. But that lived experience was valued in a way that we just haven't recognized today. So I think that there's just going to be need to be more conversations had about balancing that professionalism and recognizing that lived experience. Thanks for that question. That one made me think a little bit.
Abby, have you seen any sort of trend in like restorative practices being introduced into this world, or like what are your thoughts on that?
So the intersection between domestic violence and restorative justice is an ongoing conversation, and actually that we've had recently due to some potential changes in the Denver system. It's an interesting thing because I think, again, lay leaders of the field, and you know, the way that I was trained, you know, 100 years ago, a lot of initial resistance to utilizing restorative practices in the domestic violence and sexual assault arena. Nowadays, I think the conversation has shifted a bit, recognizing the injustices within the criminal justice system, and you know, looking at different ways rather than sort of punitive criminalizing abusive behaviors, ways that we can come from a more human approach and make generous assumptions that people who use abusive behavior can face the nature of the harm they've caused. It's a difficult rub though, because I can tell you that there are again, like leaders in this work that will tell you hands down, no, restorative justice will cause more harm for DV and SA survivors than not. So, you know, I don't know the answer to the question in terms of like what's the best way to go. What I do feel strongly about is, particularly for juveniles and young people, I think there is more of a community acceptance and understanding that for young people that are choosing to use abusive behaviors, that restorative practices that really help clarify and name the harm that was caused from a developmental perspective is just much more accessible to young people. If you could use it for an adult habitual offender, I don't know, I would take argument with that. But I think we're going to see more conversations about that in the near future. I see a question about, can I tell you a little bit about Safehouse Denver and the resources that we provide? Absolutely, I'm happy to do that. So I think about Safehouse Denver as having two main branches of our programming. We have our residential component as well as our non-residential component. So our residential services does include an emergency confidential domestic violence shelter, as the name implies. Our shelter is an initial 30-day stay with a possibility of some limited extensions. We serve people of all genders. We serve adults as well as family. People will be matched with an adult advocate or a family advocate and can choose to engage with those advocates as is most helpful for them. So services are voluntary, free of charge, right? Individual counseling and on-site support groups. In addition to our emergency shelter, we have an extended stay program, primarily for folks that have been through our shelter and even sort of larger families. It helps us sort of pluck out folks from shelter who are further along their journey towards self-sufficiency, but still need sort of a caring connection with a Safehouse Denver advocate. So it's a 6-unit apartment building with 2-bedroom apartments. And that provides an additional 60 to 90-day stay, again, with the possibility of extensions. In our non-residential services, so we call our counseling and advocacy center, really the heart of that is one-on-one advocacy work with survivors. So survivors who are not necessarily facing an acute housing crisis, but want to talk with an advocate, typically for an hour a week, each week throughout their healing journey, Survivors come from, they might be in a relationship and they're not sure yet. Is this abusive or not? Is this healthy? Helping to kind of discern that. And survivors who have identified this as an abusive relationship and I want to leave, coming up with an exit strategy and a safety plan, all the way to survivors who maybe left their abusive relationship, 10 years ago, and are now sort of navigating new healthy relationships or experiencing triggers and sort of processing through that and everything in between. Also, all of our community education programming and collaborative community partnerships come through our counseling and advocacy center. And that is all connected through our 24-hour crisis and information hotline, which is a place certainly to send survivors that are interested in engaging in services, as well as professionals, loved ones, community members, anybody who is wanting to kind of debrief a moment when they have a conversation with a survivor, learn more resources, and get their own sort of support in doing that. Do you have any further advice for how to avoid provider fatigue when your focus is childhood domestic and sexual trauma? Possibly personal strategies to use. I guess my initial answer to that is I don't know that it's possible to avoid. Avoiding isn't necessarily in and of itself a healthy process. I see it more as accepting, like I said, accepting that this work is tiresome. This work changes us. This work will lead to our own stuff coming out of left field when we didn't expect it. So I don't know that the work is to avoid it. I think, like I said, acknowledging it and then working with that. So yes, it is certainly challenging, I guess, especially it's what you're naming here, childhood domestic and sexual trauma, complex trauma. We're working with crises and survivors that have experienced some really chronic, difficult challenges throughout their lives. How do you stay energized in this work? I think the heart of it is to know your why. What is your why for doing this work? And lean on that. And really attending to that work of orienting from a process place. The outcome is the process. You will burn out faster and you will experience more effects of all of this if you hold on to a particular outcome, a desired outcome for anyone. But if you can hold on to here in this moment, I am here with the survivor and I am orienting from an empowerment-based place, and I am centered with this survivor, that's the outcome. And that can help kind of reset us. So I know it's not, I don't have the magic wand. None of us do. It's also really about making sure that you're working in trauma-informed workplaces and you're able to debrief with your supervisor and your peers. Let's see what else. Yep, having peers you feel comfortable with to share and decompressing with is key. Absolutely. Your own personal life fulfillment is important as well. I notice more compassion burnout when my life is put on the back burner. Yes. Work-life balance. There needs to be a way that we can take off our advocate hats and attend to our own lives. And not only is that critical for us, but you're also role modeling for survivors. Centering your own life is okay. In many instances, survivors are given the message directly or indirectly that attending to your own needs is not okay. But when we remove that abusive dynamic and we are in a healthy community and healthy relationships, attending to our own needs, it's okay to make that a priority.
Abby, is it all right if I jump in here for a second? I just wanted to share a couple things.
Please do.
Hi everyone. My name's Michelle, and a couple of things I wanted to say is I love how what's really stuck with me today is two things that you've addressed is more so about the process versus the outcome, and just really focusing on the process of getting the victim, or not the victim, the survivor, through on their own, and walking alongside of them. And then also the role modeling. And when the first time you mentioned that in the presentation, I just went to my, like, when you're with someone in shock or that is in a hyper state, you model the breathing, right? So that they in turn start breathing and calming themselves down. But I never really took it like that next step, as far as role modeling how we handle our conflicts, or how we are speaking in responses to their, concerns, or things that might be triggering them. And then the other, I put in the chat about, like, having other advocates or peers that you really feel safe with, I think is key, because we all need to debrief from our own experiences. So I think that is good too. And one thing I wanted to mention is that, so I work on the pediatric side at Anschutz, and we have a REST team that they do. It's resiliency, education, support, and training. And we recently did a choosing resiliency workshop. And one of the three things are, why did you choose this work? What sucks about this work? And then what brings you back to this work? And it's really interesting. I mean, we do it as a group, as a workshop, but it's something you can definitely do individually. And when we do it, the first, why did you choose this, is red. So that's something you're passionate about. You really like it, right? So you write everything in red. And then what sucks about it is done in blue, because those are where kind of the bruises can come from, right? And the things that hurt. And then what brings you back is written out in green, because that represents the growth and the newness, right? So, but it's something you can definitely kind of do on your own, and just brings you back to, like, okay, there's a reason I'm here. There's a reason I'm doing this, but also just kind of, recenters you, maybe that's not quite the right word, but just as I was looking at the chats, and I just kind of thought of that as a good kind of way that someone can just think it through on their own.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that so much, Michelle.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you. And thanks for all you do at Safehouse too.
Yeah, appreciate you. Yeah, one thing that actually came to mind as you were speaking is, when we bring the humanness to this work, we really can't mess up. And in some ways that's very liberating, right? We worry so much about saying the wrong thing. But when we orient from this place of humanness, when we say the wrong thing, it's an opportunity for rupture and repair, right? It's an opportunity for us to role model owning our own stuff, taking accountability, and moving forward, so that a survivor sees that even in those places where you mess up and cause harm, you still have value, and you still have opportunity to grow and move forward in a healthy relationship, right? And whether that's survivor advocate relationship. So sometimes in my dark moments, I remember that.
Yeah. And I think too, just, because like you said, at some point we're all going to say the wrong thing, or, it's just going to happen at one point or another. But I think the biggest, and it's so simple, but I really feel like anytime I've been, responded to a scene, or done a debriefing here at the hospital, for a situation, the biggest thing is people want that safe space, right? So they just want to have a space to breathe and share if they want to, and not share if they want to, but just to be allowed to have that space and have that, you know, someone be there, just to show up and be there. So, thank you again.
Absolutely, well said.
I think this is the time that most folks have to mosey on to the next class and our meetings. So I'm wondering if folks have questions that are lingering. Abby, are you comfortable providing like a contact number or email for them? Okay.
Sure, let me write that in the chat real quick. I'll give you both my email and my direct line.
Right, and thank you so much for being here today. And I think we can all give her a emoji or a round of applause. It's awkward over Zoom, but thank you for all of your information.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And please, you know, as things come up, feel free to reach out. I really appreciated the time, and I appreciate all the work that you all are doing. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have one more event for DV Awareness Month. On Monday, we are doing a trauma-informed yoga from noon to 1. So if folks are interested in that, please check out our website and submit a registration, and we can provide the contact details on where that is. So thanks everybody for being here, and thanks for the information.